I brought the bucket back, but it's really just full of my props for the sermon. But also, the bucket and one of these other items is also for our altar table over here. Because as you may know, if you've been coming during the summer, then you know that this is the concluding week to our sermon series on this book, An Altar in the World by Barbara Brown Taylor, which many of us have been reading, and some of us have not, and that's been okay. We've been on this journey through the summer together and touching on each chapter of Barbara Brown Taylor's book as we go on this journey. And she's talked about the ways that we can find what she calls altars in the world. Places where we can meet the divine. Places where we can experience a sense of the holy. And there are 12 chapters in this book. But that doesn't mean that there are only 12 altars in the world. And she makes that clear in the end of this book. But I wanted to bring a few items to sort of round out our altar that we've been creating over here. And one is the bucket. Because in this last chapter, Barbara Brown Taylor talks about the idea of blessings, of pronouncing and receiving blessings. And talking with the children at our stepsitters time, we talked about it as love filling up a bucket, the invisible bucket that each one of us carries. But really, blessings is another way that we could talk about that. When you receive a blessing, it helps to fill your invisible bucket that you carry. And it doesn't have to be, Barbara Brown Taylor makes this very clear, but it doesn't have to be a formal blessing from somebody like us, ordained clergy. Those are very nice, and we'll happily give them, but you don't have to get a formal blessing. There are blessings that we give each other every day, all throughout the day. Barbara Brown Taylor talks about some of those. She talks about being at an airport. Being at an airport and just noticing the people around you. And realizing that we can't really know what's been going on in their day or in their life, but we can wish a silent hope of good for them. And that's a blessing. They don't know that you've done it. They don't have to know that you've done it. But your blessing out into the universe, that puts something good. It draws these invisible connecting lines between each one of us. If I were to see Kent in a line at a store and I didn't know him, and maybe he's having a bad day and I'm having a bad day and we're grumpy at each other. But then, if I could think one of those hopes for goodness for Kent, it draws this invisible connecting line. And by necessity, it changes how I interact with him. He might not know it at all, but it changes something in me. And that changes how I am in the world. And that's what she's talking about with blessings in this last chapter. And that's what this bucket thing is all about. It changes something in you when you fill someone's bucket, when you offer love, when you offer a hope for good. And it changes something in others when they're on the receiving end. So I've brought this bucket for our altar, and I also just brought this little figure, which you probably can't see well, but it's a little girl holding a dog, just hugging him. And this was given to me by someone here in the church, and it's an angel of kindness. It's called, an angel of kindness. And I keep it in my office, sort of for the same reason that this bucket metaphor works well, especially when children are thinking about doing kindness. But it's a good reminder. When I turn around on maybe a tough day or a difficult moment, or I'm just feeling frazzled and done in, I have some days like that, not many, but some days like that. But it's a good reminder that what we're called to be about in the world is really about offering each other kindness. It's that simple. That's what Jesus was talking about, and it gets really complex because our world is so complex. In his prayer, Kent was referencing some of those complex things happening in the world. But when it comes down to it, Jesus' message was really simple. Offer kindness, fill one another's buckets, do good in the world. Now, if you're like me, maybe you might have struggled a little bit with this book this summer. I'm going to be really honest and just say that I think this is a good reminder that no one book is going to strike every person who reads it the same way. I really came to enjoy this book. Kent knows this, don't worry, this is not taking him by surprise. We talked about this at Deacons, and I said And I'm saying this because I think if you've gone through this exercise of reading the book or hearing the sermons, and it was not your favorite book, that's okay. And what I came to realize is that for me, my first inclination is to want to pick up a book and read about social justice in action and how we live out our faith, or maybe a heady academic book. This is a contemplative book. But what I came to realize is that we all have different kinds of spiritual muscles that we're working. Those of you who go to the gym, you're working different muscle sets when you go to the gym. I'm not one of those people, but that's what I understand. And we have different spiritual muscles. And as a church, our social justice muscle is really strong. And for me personally, that might be my best developed spiritual muscle. You only get better at the other muscles when you work them. And so I came to realize that it's good for me to stretch my spiritual muscles, to read a book like this. And that at the end of the day, when I read her chapter on blessings, I came to realize that this journey through these different altars in the world, and there are many more than 12, in the end, it is about social action. Because when we change how we are in the world, then we change how we act in the world. And that does work to build up God's reign of love.
So Jacob was a guy who was really in need of a blessing. If anybody needed a blessing, it was old Jacob. So if you'd like, you don't have to, but I invite you to turn to the passage again, Genesis chapter 32, verse 24. So the word Jacob means rip-off artist. It does. I don't want to offend anyone who's got a family member or is named Jacob, but the word Jacob actually in Hebrew means he who supplants, he who uproots. That's what the word Jacob means. Because Jacob stole the birthright that was intended for his brother Esau, he, dressed in disguise, he disguised himself before his father who was blind, and Isaac, who was to give the blessing to Esau, the brother, gave it to Jacob by mistake. So Jacob is a guy who has conned those closest to him. And he's fleeing for his life. And one of the powerful things about Scripture is that the Bible uses the most unlikely of people, like Jacob, to be the source of blessing. And why God uses unlikely people like Jacob or like me or like you is beyond our imagination. But God always sees our potential when we may see the limitations in someone like Jacob, or maybe even see the limitations in ourselves. Verse 24, and Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. And we discover, the illusion is towards the end of this remarkable story, that the stranger is God in disguise. Have you ever wrestled with God? You ever wake up at 3 in the morning and you're working your worry beads and you're really struggling as to what to do? And we begin to have that conversation with God. Because God has a plan for Jacob. And even out of someone like Jacob, this con man, God is going to bring about good. And so there's a wrestling match that takes place. And Jacob knows that tomorrow he's going to face his brother Esau. He's probably going to die. And he's holding on to God tight at 3 in the morning. And he says to God, I am not going to release you until you give me a blessing. And it's not because Jacob is so strong, but because it is the nature of God to bless us and to bless even someone like Jacob. And he gives him a new name, a new identity, which is Israel. That's where the name comes from. And the word Israel means he who persevered with God and with human beings. Say what you will about Jacob. There's something in him that won't quit. He makes so many mistakes. He does so many wrong and bad things. but he's also a person of faith. He knows that he is imperfect. He knows that he has done terrible things. And so he clings to God at 3 in the morning and says, bless me. Give me hope. Bring healing into my life. Show me a new path. And God honors the sincerity, the humility of Jacob. But just to show Jacob who is God, he puts his hip out of joint. And I love the final scene. Walking into the sunset is Jacob with a limp. He has not overcome God, but he has hung in there with God, and he has been blessed. This summer, we've been invited to think about how we have been blessed by God and a blessing to others. 3 weeks ago, I was on vacation. Don't you love vacation? It's great. And you know, on Sunday morning, not everybody goes to church. No, it's true. Yeah, there are people out on Sunday morning doing other things. I was amazed. Yeah. So I got in my kayak at 7 in the morning, and I kayak over to Marblehead. Where Marblehead and Salem meet, there's a beach. What's that park known as? There's a wonderful little green park. There's a beach. No, not Waikiki Beach. There's even, I know Waikiki Beach, there's even a further beach down towards Marblehead. There's a park, and I went swimming, and I got some stones. It was just me, and I built this altar. And I was in church. And I thanked God for the beauty of God's creation, and I felt blessed. I felt truly blessed. What this summer has been for me, Julie, is a reminder to mark those moments, those aha moments, when we sense, and I sensed, that the creator of heaven and earth, the creator of the beauty of the North Shore, was blessing me at that very moment. And so I built a little altar right on the beach, and then I went for a swim.
Right on a secret beach, apparently, that nobody knows it. Yeah, a secret beach.
A secret beach.
Devereaux Beach, she says.
Devereaux Beach? Devereaux Beach.
Well, as Kent was talking about wrestling with God, I was thinking about what I just admitted to you about this book and sort of my journey with it, and I thought maybe that was my wrestling with God. And maybe for all of us, there are ways that those things do enter into our lives, maybe not just through our worries, but through the things that really push us, that really challenge us. This book was put before us as a congregation. You had the option to read it or not, and that's good and right. I, as someone who was preaching on it, had to face the book. And I started off, you might remember, some of you will remember, I started off reading it when I had jury duty. And my bookmark to the very end there in the Blessings chapter is my juror number, 29. But I started reading it when I had jury duty, and I talked about how no one sat near me, and then I realized I had my Bible and my Altar in the World and another church book all spread out, and it was a crowded jury room. I was the only one with seats beside me. But you know, I started on that journey, and then those questions started coming into my head like, oh, well, this isn't really the style of book I really love, but I'll keep going. This isn't really maybe my first choice, but I have to preach on this chapter. But you know, as I went deeper and deeper, there was never a chapter where I didn't have at least one thing underlined, more than once. Because there were always kernels of wisdom, things I hadn't thought about, ways God was pushing me, using Barbara Brown Taylor to push me. Kent talked about God using regular people. We don't even have to know them. I don't know her personally, but her words pushed me to think about the ways that I could strengthen my contemplative life and use that to fill my invisible bucket. And then use my filled bucket, use that strength that I was gaining to do the work in the world that we're called to do. And so the contemplative life and the social justice life, they don't have to be disparate. And perhaps for you, you've already figured that out. That might not be your struggle with God. You might not have been wrestling about that one. And it might seem really obvious. But for me, that was some of my wrestling this summer. But you know, there are so many things that need our work, that need our help, that need our love. You can probably think of many right now. Just in the past few days, the news cycle has been full of stories, heart-wrenching stories of violence. News anchors killed while they're doing a news report. Or just yesterday, I came home and I was scrolling through the news on my phone, and there was a story about violence that erupted in the P.F. Chang's restaurant at the North Shore Mall, of all places. You know, and I thought, the North Shore Mall, it seems so quiet. Our world is hurting. And we know that people are hurting, and we're hurting in our different, unique ways. The world needs our good work. The world needs God's love. But we can't offer it unless we also are filling our buckets. Unless we're strengthening those muscles. Whatever your way of coming and being filled up is, you don't have to subscribe to one of the 12 in this book. In fact, at the end, she closes with a poem from the Sufi poet Rumi. And you may not be familiar with his work, but Rumi is one of the poets that I just really love. He writes these poems that kind of get to the heart of things with very few words. He's really the master of poetry at its finest, which is using the space between words to tell the story. But she closes with this line from Rumi that says, "There are thousands of ways to kneel and kiss the ground." There are thousands of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. You don't have to worship at one of these 12 altars. You don't have to worship every Sunday within the walls of a church, although we love having you here. You don't have to build your own altar on a beach, maybe Devereaux Beach or Waikiki, or we're not sure where Kent went. But you could. But there are thousands of ways and places that we can kneel and kiss the ground. Thousands of ways to experience God's presence. Thousands of ways to receive a blessing. But not just that. There are thousands of ways to give a blessing. Thousands of ways to share God's love with the world. Thousands of ways to reach out and draw one of those invisible connecting lines to somebody else, whether you know them or not. So throughout the summer, I have been wrestling. I've been wrestling with Barbara Brown Taylor, but she didn't know it. And I've been maybe wrestling with God. And I've come through. And so if you wrestled with this book, know that you were in good company. If you didn't read the book, that's fine. And if you loved the book, that's wonderful. I think part of it is being able to share what our wrestling matches have been. Because in that, too, we can find blessing, find places of connection, and realize that we together are on this human journey, seeking the ways that we can find God, know God, and share God's love with the world.
So one thing I know about Julie is that she listens to music of my generation, and I listen to music of her generation.
Yeah, we're really flip-flopped around.
Yeah, we flip-flop. So here's one that you would know, Jackson Browne, one of the great rockers of my generation. Everybody know Jackson Browne? Had a song called Running on Empty. One of the great
Running on Empty.
Da, da, da. Here's Sarah, she's out dancing in the back. The reason we talk about a contemplative life as a church that tends towards the activist, tends to working to make the world a better place. A bunch of us were here helping to staff the soup kitchen yesterday. We had a wonderful time. We're a leader in the North Shore and housing, affordable housing. We're planning for a mission team next summer. We've got some plans down the road to hopefully send a team down to Nicaragua on a mission trip. This is a church. Bobby's organizing Family Promise, and we'll be hosting 3 homeless families in a couple of weeks. And 4 homeless families, starting what day? September 13th, and we're going to be needing volunteers. Speak to Bobby. We're going to be hosting them with the Unitarian Church across the street. We know how to do service, right? Yet we're running on empty unless we ground ourselves in relationship to the one who has the heart for the world. And that's what this summer has been about for me, Julie, is a reminder to remain rooted in the one who is the source of all that is good, lasting, and true, to be rooted in the story of Jesus that continues to change hearts and minds and our actions, to give us the strength to do what we need to do, not just next week, but next year and the year following. Otherwise, we're running on empty. We need to be reminded that we are standing on holy ground and that God speaks into the most unlikely of times, just like meeting Jacob in the middle of the night. And by the way, the next part of the story is the next day Esau has a change of heart because God is at work in Esau's heart, and he embraces his brother, and there's reconciliation because of the power of God to bring about a blessing. But this is an invitation to remember that we are on holy ground. On Friday, Julie and I were doing a little tour of the building and thinking about some garden art for some time this fall. And the idea of the garden art is to let the community know that we are a welcoming and caring place. So we're just kicking around some ideas, and two neighbors of ours who are homeless walked by. And one guy said, are you pastors? And we said, yeah. And the guy who we did not know, who we will call Bert, not his real name, began to tell us his story, that he had been arrested the night before, spent the night in jail. His girlfriend had thrown all of his possessions into an undisclosed dumpster, and he hadn't eaten in a few days, and he was strung out. It was clear that this person was really a wounded soul and really struggling. And then he said, will you help me find a place to spend the night, and will you help me with a meal? Now that was interrupting our business meeting, right, Julie? We had things to do. We had a schedule to keep.
We had art to work on.
We had art to work on. But both Julie and I had, when we talked later, we had the sense that this was not just this fragile, wounded soul who had a need, but we were on holy ground. Jesus says, whatever you do unto the most vulnerable of my sisters and brothers, you do unto me. So when we were looking at the bloodshot eyes of Bert, who was drying out and you could still smell the beer on his breath, we sensed we were looking into the eyes of Jesus. So Julie had some responsibilities. We decided that I would take Bert, and we went to the Atomic Cafe. We got a really nice sandwich for him, and then we found out where he had some family, and we found a way of getting him there. And at the end, just before we were to say goodbye, Bert said, can I offer a prayer for you? So on the sidewalk in front of the Atomic Cafe on Cabot Street, Bert offered me a blessing. God speaks into our lives in the most unlikely of circumstances, in the most unlikely of people, that God speaks through Jacob and through our dreams and through our struggles, and God speaks through Bert, and God speaks through you and me. And this summer is all about being aware and opening our hearts, our minds, and imaginations. And so going forward, as we move into the busyness of the fall, and Vinny, as you're back going to school and doing homework, call me if you need me, okay? We need to remind ourselves that we are standing always on holy ground. And God, the creator of heaven and earth, always desires to speak in a way that we can hear, so that we might be blessed
And be a blessing.
and be a blessing. This is the good news. Thanks be to God, and may God's people say,
Amen.
amen.